Chapter 24, Part 3 is the changing family, science, and thought. We're still dealing with life in cities, primarily caused by the Industrial Revolution, and in today's section, it will talk about the effect of that change from rural to urban life on families, raising of children, marriages, ultimately also in the realm of science, and lastly, a shift from romanticism to a form of literature and art called realism. Section A, from the section on the changing family. Basically, this is a section on marriage. So marriage, they define the differences between marriages for working class people and middle class people. We learned about those distinctions in the last lecture. So for the working class, marriages basically become based on romantic love. People fell in love with someone they were attracted to, and they got married for love, which had always been kind of the fact of a working class person. Very different from middle class people. Going back from even long before this, marriages are based on economic considerations if you're in the middle class, not really on love. It's a financial transaction. You use marriage to get ahead in society, to improve your standing, your status, your stock, your prospects. Dowries were always important in the middle class. This would be the amount of money or some sort of gift that the bride's parents would make to the future husband, sort of like a down payment to secure a good husband for the daughter. A lot of times men waited until they were much later in life to get married. They wanted to make a really good living first. They wanted to acquire property, perhaps own a business, certainly accumulate wealth. And they would often take younger wives as wives because they were in their mid-40s sometimes, even 50, and they'd want to get married to someone that was in their 20s that was of childbearing age. So you have all these marriages of the middle class between primarily older men and younger women, which is an interesting side effect. For girls, this was their big shot in life of the middle class. If they could get married to the right guy, this was really their ticket to success. The mothers, girls were very guarded by their mothers, and the mothers were very involved in their romantic life and in the arrangement of these marriages. Not a lot of choice for young girls in terms of who they were marrying. Their mothers were very, very involved. There were a lot of illegitimate births. Back to the working class, we sort of switch back here. Lots of illegitimate births in urban cities among the working class. 1 out of 3 children was born without a married mother. It's a lot, 1/3. But this was not things that were talked about in this age. This is 19th century, primarily England and France, and this is known as the Victorian age. And these dirtier, grittier aspects of life, no one really wanted to talk about it. So even though this was happening all around everybody, it wasn't written about very much because this didn't really conform to the moral standards of the day. One thing that changed towards the end of the century, in the 19th century, among working class women is that they would often get married if they were pregnant. So this was a shift from men that would just skip out in the earlier days of the illegitimacy explosion that we learned about back in chapter 19, I believe. So we end up with more stable families towards the end of the century. Section B, prostitution, very unusual section, very interesting section. They talk a lot in this chapter about the morality of the middle class, and we read about that in the last section, how the middle class professed to have this really high standard of living and of their behavior and their marriages, and this really flies in the face of that. There's a double standard here, there's some hypocrisy. According to our text at least, this was a quite popular thing for middle and upper class men, even after they were married. The book gives you some statistics on this, that in the year 1900, there were 900,000 prostitutes working in Paris. 150 or so thousand of them were registered, and they were official. They had licenses, and another 700,000 were just simply suspected of doing that. So they claim this was a very, very predominant phenomenon, particularly, again, among the middle classes and upper classes. So you see that conflict between what middle class people said they were doing in terms of their morality, influenced by the Puritans and obviously the Reformation and Christianity, and then the way they were really living, kind of behind the scenes, a double standard. There were even people that wrote books about this. There's a particular book called My Secret Life that details a young Englishman and all of his various adventures, chasing after women, documenting this. This was published anonymously because it wouldn't have been appropriate for that person to identify themselves. So even this was appearing in literature. And then the last claim that our text makes is that prostitution was simply a stage of life for many women of the lower classes as they grew up. This was just maybe one of the many jobs they would have as part of their life. Whether or not all of this is entirely true, it's hard to say. There aren't really records of this. This is a lot of data drawn from data and of anecdotes, and it's not quite as hard of a science as something like employment rates or something like that. But nevertheless, the conclusions are made that this was a predominant thing among the middle class. Go ahead and flip the page. Section C, still on the family. Kinship ties. We're talking about the working class here. So working class people had hard lives, and one thing that came out of that was that their ties to their family grew stronger as they survived different sicknesses, crises, maybe the death of a child. These tragedies often strengthen the bonds between families. Again, particularly speaking of the working class. So working class family ties grew, and whereas middle class families, as we'll see, maybe weren't as close to one another. They didn't have as many difficult things. And one of the unique aspects of middle or working class family life was that they would do a Sunday dinner, a traditional Sunday family dinner. And you can ask yourself here, do you do that? How often does your family get together for a dinner together where you talk and share your lives with one another? This was a particularly common thing among working class people in the mid-19th century. Section D, gender roles and family life. So a lot of this is going to be the same as what we've heard in the past. Beginning for middle class women, again, that had always been the case that a middle class and upper class woman was supposed to be domestic. But now that moves down the spectrum to the working class as well. And women of the working class, if they were married, that's the key, if they were married, they were supposed to maintain those separate spheres where women work in the home and men are the wage earners that work in the workplace. And that's a change. We learned about that a couple of chapters ago, where working class women used to be farmers, and they worked right alongside the husband and kids. The whole family was together. And beginning with the factory system, that nature of work began to change. And so there's a decreasing opportunities for married women for work. It was just simply not the expectation that married women would work. And so opportunities for jobs and pay was always much lower than for men. So work opportunities diminished. Also at this point, you have legal distinctions made between men and women that are really written down in the written law. So women were not allowed to own property in their own name in the mid and late 19th century. And the Napoleonic Code, of course, had restrictions on women's rights and prevented women from being able to divorce or maintain sole custody of children. So this was sort of a setback of the late 19th century for particularly married women of all classes, but now it really has affected the working class. So you can see that there would be a struggle for equality that began. There was the feminist movement really starts mid-19th century in England and in Germany. And there's two approaches to that. There were two different groups of feminists that were making a cause for more equal rights. There's the middle class group. So these are wealthy women. They're educated. Their husbands are wealthy. This would be someone like Mary Wollstonecraft, who was the mother of Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. And we learned about Mary Wollstonecraft back a little bit in the Enlightenment, a little bit in the French Revolution. So her work is still being read and studied at this point. And these women, what they wanted primarily was access to education and voting. They wanted basic political rights, access to universities, the ability to earn an advanced degree, more opportunities for employment and higher wages. And what they got out of this struggle, these educated, they were liberal, I would say, with this 1882 English property law granted women full rights to own property, and this was an advancement. The second approach to the feminist movement really was among socialist and Marxist feminists, and a lot of these women would have come from the working class, so it sort of depended on what class you were in. And these women, just like the men, were calling for full-scale revolution, where we would overthrow the middle classes, the bourgeoisie, And really, like Marx said, this was going to be a worldwide thing. It wasn't going to stay in one country. So these, obviously, it was more radical, more willingness to participate in violence, whereas that middle class approach was definitely more, let's work within the system, let's advocate, campaign, have rallies. And then the socialist Marxist approach was more violent in general. So these are mainly in Germany. The Marxist movement among women was very common in the German states, future Germany, whereas middle class feminism was really an English thing. Now, all that being said, there was, even for all classes of women, an increasing control over the home. So it's not all negative. So even though women were in this separate sphere in the home, women gained power over finances in terms of they could spend the money that the husband made on pretty much whatever they wanted. Educational decisions for the children, religious decisions. So these are things that women began to control, and they constituted what's called the real power behind the throne. Women are the power behind the throne in the 19th century in Europe, and you can ask yourself that question as that relates to today, whether that's true or not among yourselves, among friends and families you know, or whether it is certainly that more traditional male-dominated relationship. Turn over to page 10. So that's number 7 here, on family life. So as women became more prominent in the home and their domestic power increased, there was an increased emotional importance of the home. The home became a distinct place from the workplace, whereas in the rural times on the farm, the home and the workplace were all the same thing. So a lot of families would put up mottos or slogans across their door. God bless this home. Home is where the heart is. You've heard things like this. Home life became a very distinct thing in Western society. Married couples became happier, according to our text. Husbands and wives became more affectionate. There were even manuals written for the first sort of self-help books to help married couples know how to get along. And this book, very famous book by Gustav Droz called Mr., Mrs., and Baby. It's a self-help book on how to be married and raise kids. And this conclusions were very simple. You need to be romantic. Being in love is important. You have to put time and effort into your romances. You need to take your wife on date night. You need to marry someone your own age. This was another thing he said. He said, stop marrying old men that are not going to make you happy. They might have money, but emotionally that's not going to work. So there's a very practical book, very modern type of book written for people in the late 19th century. And then that translated into section E here into child raising. People began to do a better job raising their children. Remember back to chapter 20 how brutal it was for children. They died so often, they were neglected emotionally, physically. Women did not nurse their children in the 18th century, but now there's a change as the home becomes more important and women are more present in it. There's more nursing of babies. Women began to nurse their own babies a lot more than they had in the past. Fathers began to take a more active role in the raising of children. They were encouraged by books like that Droz book to play with their kids, get on the floor, run around. And all this culminated in fewer children being turned over for adoption, turned into orphans and put in foundling homes. So there's almost a revolution among family life for the better. Also, the second, maybe even most important part of these changes in the family is that the birth rate really goes down dramatically. People start having fewer kids. The average woman had 6 kids in the 18th century, and in the 19th century in cities, that's down to 2. So the average woman is now only having about 2 kids. That's pretty common even today, very modern. I think the American birth rate is slightly over 2 children per woman, and the reasons for that were mainly economic and social. Children are not workers anymore on the farm. You don't need as many of them for extra labor. And also there's a social reason. Kids cost money, and the fewer of them we have, the better we can provide for the ones that we do. And we want to get ahead in life. We want to make our lives for our children better. And the way we do that is we don't have as many, and then we can actually devote more time and money and attention to the ones that we have. So this is a remarkable revolution in the number of children born. Family size shrinks. Now, when there's fewer kids, and there's only, let's say, 1, 2, or 3 per family, sometimes the attention parents paid to those kids became really intense. And this sounds very modern for some of us, I would imagine. A lot of parents began to control their teenage children's lives and plan them out for them and really take a very maybe overactive role in putting expectations on kids and a lot of fear, a lot of pressure. Parents in the 19th century were afraid that their own bad behavior or bad traits would be passed down into their children. They didn't really understand modern genetics, of course. A lot of the teenagers in the 19th century that were of the middle class, particularly, this is middle class now, were, the relationship kind of broke down with their parents as all the pressure built. Lots of efforts to control the teenagers' romantic lives and dating lives, and you'll read, if you do the reading in that section, very interesting methods were used to try to control the behavior of kids growing up. As the children grew older, again here in the middle class particularly, even though the relationship was good when they were little, all of a sudden their adolescence and the father-child relationships sort of broke down. The fathers were often out of the home a lot, at work. They were distant, they traveled a lot. So a lot of literature reflects the tension between adolescents and their fathers. The Russians, and we're going to learn about the realists here in a minute, were particularly aware of this troubled relationship. And the Brothers Karamazov is a book, famous book by Dostoevsky, that details the four brothers and their efforts to destroy their father, whether it was consciously or unconsciously, a lot of their effort to get rid of him because he was such a bad father. Turn over to page 11. All of these tensions of the family really culminate in the work of Freud, and you're going to learn about Freud, I hope, in other classes, possibly English class, and Freud's work is very important, very famous. He's the first modern psychologist. Some would call him a psychiatrist. He was making an effort to explain people's behavior in a new way. The Enlightenment and the Philosophes said everything was rational, everything was predictable, everything could be figured out. There was a direct cause and effect relationship of everything. We could learn the secrets of human relationships just like a science experiment. Freud's work really changed all of that, and he said that all of us are motivated primarily by unconscious motives, desires, troubles, pain. Everything of note that's kind of going on in our life as an adult probably started when we were children, with early childhood experiences. Well, some of them were negative. The way you were potty trained, he wrote a lot about that, how that can be a really traumatic experience for a kid. Maybe words were spoken over someone negatively, or they didn't have a great set of parents. So whatever happened as a child, he said these memories go into your subconscious, and you're for the rest of your life you're trying to repress them. These bitter experiences, you're practicing what's called repression, and you don't even know it. It's all unconscious to you, but your life and your mind is making an effort to repress and put away these painful experiences. One of the other unique things that he came up with was a theory known as the Oedipus complex or Oedipal tension, where he said that, really under the surface in every family there's competition between the sons and the father over the love, emotional affection, and time spent with the mother. So sons and fathers fighting over the mother. And he based this on a lot of things. Some of the works of ancient Greece, the literature and stories of ancient Greece had this in there. And he just said that's with the smallness of the modern family and the drivenness of the men of that generation, there was going to be this unusual conflict between sons and fathers. The bottom line, I guess, with Freud is that he said we all have what are called defense mechanisms, which are things that those are our behaviors, our outward behaviors that are based on our repression, our tension, and our early childhood experiences. Keeping in mind, again, this is all unconscious. We're not aware of this really. And so we develop behavior patterns, whether that's being maybe overtly talkative or maybe very, very quiet, the way we relate with people, interact, some would say our insecurities that are very evident to other people. All of those things are because of things in our past. And the way that you get them out is you go under hypnosis and somebody gets you to share things from your subconscious, and then you can get some sort of healing from those. So a very interesting approach to modern psychology. His work still is the basis of modern psychology. When people have trouble, they go to psychologists, and similar things are practiced where you have to get in touch with these things you may not even be aware about. His work really did reflect the tensions of this new middle-class small family that were all very focused on one another. This is not the case in the working class. The children of the working class left home early, they worked, They got jobs, lived away from home. There wasn't quite as much of this family tension as there was in the middle class. And so Freud really wrote the basis of his theories were sort of focused on middle class families alone. Again, I hope you make lots of modern connections to other classes that you've studied this in, perhaps. Look up an article on Freud, read about him. Very important theory. Lots of essay questions on the AP exam get asked about Freud. So please take some time and really read about his theories in more depth. Section 4, switching up a little bit here, science and thought. So this is, again, the effect of industrial urban life on scientific developments, and then the way people wrote about life and in the arts as well. So this is a time in the late 19th century where all of a sudden science begins to get very practical. We've been through the scientific revolution with Galileo and Newton and all of these guys from the 17th and 18th centuries, and at that time science was just theoretical, not very practical. Nothing really trickled down to help the people's daily life. But now it changes, and it does. So this is the age where science produces tangible gains to all members of society and improve the way people lived. It's really almost like a second scientific revolution. There's breakthroughs in thermodynamics, which you should look that word up and so you know what it means. There's breakthroughs in chemistry and electricity. Mendeleev basically formulates and codifies the periodic table of elements. So these are things that now you get to study in 10th grade chemistry. Organic chemistry as a unique field of chemistry really comes into its existence. Michael Faraday is a famous scientist of the mid to late 19th century. He invented the first generator, which was called a dynamo, and he was doing the work that foreshadowed the beginnings of electricity. Obviously, once you have electricity, the world is going to be completely changed. Electric motors, lights, the streetcars, subway systems, all of that is really on the edge of happening here in the 1850s and 60s with the work of these guys in science and chemistry and in early forms of electricity. Over to page 12. Scientific companies begin to be developed. Major businesses that start to invest a lot in research and development. They want to push the boundaries of science and where they were at. So that modern term of R&D really came into its own in the late 19th century. So advancing science and new inventions and discoveries became a priority for big companies, particularly in Germany, in England, and in France. The consequences of this second scientific revolution, in addition to practical benefits that were changing people's daily lives, is that science became very popular among all classes because people were seeing the effect of it firsthand. There was an interest in popular science, and people began to read articles, even at a very basic level, of what was happening. Second thing, faith in human progress. That sounds like the Enlightenment, and it is. It's sort of a continuation of that. Look at what we can do. We can accomplish anything through our progress, our science, our technology. And science really gained prestige among all groups, not just among scientists themselves, but among widespread levels of society, and particularly when compared to religion, which, as we'll see in a moment here, is really taking a hit. It's on the decline in the late 19th century. Section C, social science and evolution. So we've studied hard science, and now we move back into the realm of social scientists, which was really what the Enlightenment was all about. They built on the work of the hard scientists like Newton and Galileo and Descartes. And so the same thing is happening here. There's breakthroughs in hard science followed by breakthroughs in social science. And social science is when we study people. We use scientific approaches to study human problems and try to come up with similar conclusions. Much like some of the later philosophers of the Enlightenment that became atheists, the philosophers here of the 19th century were very dogmatic and rigid, which means they weren't flexible. They were very strict in what they saw. They were very strictly secular, most of them. They had no place for religion in what they were saying. The religion was of no use to them. The most important, maybe, of these early folks was a man named Auguste Comte, who had a book called The System of Positive Philosophy. This is hard. You may want to look into this a bit more. He said in every process in life, there are 3 stages. Stage 1 is called the theological, and he also said that's fiction. It's fictitious, where we just sort of attribute everything to God that we don't understand, whether it's a scientific thing or a personal thing or a societal thing. We don't know, and so we say that God must be at work here. So that's stage one. Stage two is the metaphysical and abstract phase, where people understood there was more to the answer than what they had known in the past, but they couldn't figure it out yet. So it was sort of like the stage of the unknown. It was a transitional stage. Stage three is the scientific phase, also known as the positive phase. And this is where you come up with real answers based on science. And this was the goal, he said. Everything ends here. It sort of starts with religion and it ends with science. So this positivist method is just another way of saying that the scientific method ought to be applied to every area of life. And again, in terms of, this is not compatible with religion. Comte, his system of philosophy was very secular. He was an atheist. He was almost practicing a religion based on science, and he was claiming that the people that ought to rule the world are these so-called experts, technical experts, scientific experts. No longer should religious people, priests, the Pope, any of that, they should not rule the world, but it should be ruled by these experts of the modern method. He pointed out the first scientific revolution with the way people used to approach astronomy and cosmology, and said, look at that, that's a perfect example of how we've made progress. But he said that would apply also to every other problem in our life and in society. The theory of evolution really is written for the first time here in the 19th century, and this is going to be the work of Darwin, and we'll see that here in a minute. You know this, I hope, from other classes. The theory of evolution really starts with the work of a scientist named Lyell, who was a geologist, and his main contribution was studying the surface of the Earth and really trying to figure out the age of the Earth. And he said it was much older than a lot of people thought. He said the Earth is older than 5,000 years. And here's my theory on why it is that it's not, the Earth wasn't formed by floods and earthquakes and biblical events. It's much, much older. And so this gets a lot of attention among people in Europe who are still very, very religious. Another scientist named Lamarck was the first to propose a biological aspect to evolution, that perhaps all life on the planet was somehow related going back millions of years as well. That work was really built upon by Darwin. Turn to page 13. Darwin is most known for his work in the theory of evolution, of course, and his book is known as The Origin of Species from 1859. And in it, he described how most living things on Earth have engaged in millions of years of a struggle for survival against nature, against one another, and that the strongest plants and animals, the strongest things have been the ones that survived. And he did point, he said, there was a common ancestor to all of living creatures on Earth. And that, again, is a very radical theory, very much opposes some of the nature of Christianity and of religion and Judaism, which point to a creator. And going back to the book of Genesis, we've studied this in this class before, the conflict between religion and science. So another key point in his work was the idea of natural selection, which is that over the millennia of time, nature selects certain things to move on and evolve, and other traits and characteristics go away. And so the species gets better over time because we toughen up against all odds and this kind of thing. And ultimately what this does is it reinforces a very secular worldview, which is becoming very popular, particularly among the middle classes in 19th century Europe. Now a very important man named Herbert Spencer took the ideas of Darwin, which were primarily in the realm of animals and plants and the physical world, and he applied those ideas to human beings, and in a way that was very, maybe some would say perverse, very twisted. He is the one that coined this term survival of the fittest as it relates to people. And he said, essentially, much like in the animal world and in the plant world and in the physical world, how we see better animals surviving and weaker animals going away, that's the same with people. There are better people and stronger people, and those people's destiny is to rule the weak. And he said certainly that the rich are the strong ones because by their nature, they've earned something, they've fought for something, they've acquired and achieved. And poor people are the weak ones, and their destiny is to be ruled by the rich. And this has a unique, really dangerous future ahead of it. It's known as social Darwinism, I mean, the application of Darwin's ideas about the animal world to the human world, and it really becomes justified when one group of people says that we're better than you and we really ought to rule you. This is going to be used to justify imperialism when Europeans go and take big colonies in Africa and in Asia and other parts of the world. Europeans believed themselves to be superior people, and it was their job and their right to rule inferior people. That's Spencer's ideas. This culminates, obviously, in one of the most twisted examples of all of human history, which is the Germans in the Second World War. The Nazi Germans were very much believers in social Darwinism. They believed that the German people specifically were the superhumans. They were the master race. By their nature, they had survived. They were the fittest. They were the strongest, and it was their job and their purpose in life to conquer, dominate, and enslave the weak. So this theory, very dangerous theory that was put out by Spencer, built on the work of Darwin, but was going to be used for a lot of dangerous things moving forward. The last section is realism in literature. So in about the 1840s, there's a major shift from Romanticism as the dominant style of literature to realism. And Romanticism was all about emotion and passion and big ideas and yearning for the future, very lofty, lots of deep thinking, wishing the world was different. And realism could not be more opposite of Romanticism. Realism looks at things exactly the way they are, in the strictest sense, very much based in reality, not dreaming of another world, but the way things are. It's edgy. It was sort of in line with the science of the day in that it was based on being objective. You want scientific objectivity in literature and in art. We want to paint things exactly the way they are, whether it's clean or dirty or ugly or beautiful. Forget living in some other world, another conception. We want to live right now. We want to paint the effect of the industrial life on families. We want to write about the effect of these new family changes in the middle class. No sugarcoating of the truth. So observation, they rejected Romanticism. They wanted to focus on particularly the working class, which had more trouble, at least more poverty, more sickness, things that were a little bit more glaring and in your face. So they wrote about working class people. They painted that as well. They wrote about taboo subject matter, things that you couldn't really write about in the Victorian age. Violence, alcoholism, bad marriages, abandonment of children, infidelity. These are all things that started to be written about in a very modern way that was simply not permitted before. The realists are known as strict determinists, which means they believe that natural laws and heredity and the environment, three things, determined all of human behavior. There was no room for any other explanation. They were very strict in their scientific views of the world. Not quite like what we were just talking about, going back to Freud, where he was a little more in the unconscious. These realist painters and writers thought that everything was a product of the environment around you and that there was really no escaping these natural laws that we're all bound by. Last page, almost finished. There were several groups of realists. There's French, English, and Russian. The French are perhaps the most important. There's three men, Balzac, Flaubert, and Zola. And these guys all wrote about very modern themes. Balzac's work, The Human Comedy, has themes of social Darwinism in it. Greed, he has over 2,000 characters in that book, The Human Comedy. Flaubert's famous book, is known as Madame Bovary. This deals primarily with the middle class. There's a woman, a middle class wife, has an affair with another man, and then she's betrayed by him. So betrayal, very modern, gritty themes. Zola's work has working class themes to it. Also social. He's a socialist, so he's advocating for that kind of radical change that we've learned about in the past. You may want to look these three people up and just read little biographies of them and some of their work and get a little deeper perspective on that. There was a couple English realists. George Eliot actually was the pen name of a woman who wrote under a man's name so that her work would be published more prominently. Thomas Hardy's books are filled with ideas about fate and bad luck and how we can be crushed. Even if we've tried to live a good life, bad things happen to good people. And the Russian realists are really the most intense of all. Tolstoy, Dostoevsky. And these are great books. War and Peace was set during the Napoleonic Wars in Russia in the 1810s to 1815. Lots of emphasis on fatalism, and there's nothing we can do to control our what happens. And so it's really, they're sometimes depressing, these books. Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment is not mentioned in your textbook, but you should look this up. This is one of the great masterpieces of realist literature. It deals with the story of a young man that commits murder, and then what that does to him psychologically is he struggles with guilt and depression, and all of his life crumbles all around him. I read that book in high school myself. I've got a good story to tell you about Crime and Punishment, so remind me to tell it to you when we come to class. So that's it for chapter 24, which again was life in the emerging urban society.